Now available, paperback and Kindle Unlimited, ISIS, the main event. It's carnage inside of a steel cage when the goddess next door steps in the squared circle with the beast from the boss in this action-packed all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, the main event, paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.
Yesterday marked the end of an era for pro wrestling. Vince McMahon, the head of World Wrestling Entertainment, is retiring after 40 years in the business. Now, your Vince McMahon is alleged to have been forced to step down in the aftermath of a series of scandals relating to sexual harassment and other scandals where he allegedly had to pay off women as related to keeping their mouths shut as related to affairs they had with him. Now, even in spite of this ignominious end, which actually mirrors that of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, your Vince McMahon's legacy in the wrestling business is one that will never be forgotten, and it is a permanent part of American history. Your Vince McMahon basically revolutionized the wrestling business back in the 1980s when he took professional wrestling from a local affair that was presented on small TV networks and turned it into an international phenomenon that became a part of American pop culture. Your Vince McMahon had a grand vision for professional wrestling, and back in the 1980s, he basically made wrestling a part of American culture as he ushered in what many call the era of rock and wrestling, when your Hulk Hogan went on to become the WWF champion and basically turned wrestling again from a regional thing into a national phenomenon that everyone was a part of. So your Vince McMahon basically transformed pro wrestling back in the 1980s, and once he transformed professional wrestling, it became a major part of American culture, and as it became a part of American culture, we went from different eras in wrestling, and those different eras in wrestling became a major part of pop culture. I remember growing up when WWF, which is what it was called back in the 80s, first came into national and international prominence. That's when Hulk Hogan won the WWF Championship and became the face of American wrestling and became one of the major faces of American pop culture. And I basically grew up watching WWF Superstars back in the 80s when it was on Channel 9 at about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And I also watched your Saturday night's main event. And I remember in 89 reading about how your Vince McMahon became a major part of American culture in GQ magazine when they featured him in an article in GQ, and that was when I first learned that wrestling wasn't real, but I became intrigued because after I learned it wasn't real, it just showed me there was a major business side to wrestling, and it was just fascinating to see that there was more to it than what I saw on screen. And as the years went on, your Vince McMahon continued to build his empire with the World Wrestling Federation and Titan Sports. And as the rock and wrestling era ended in the 90s, we got the new generation. And while the new generation struggled for a while to find its footing, it laid the foundation for what was going to be the second golden age of wrestling. And that second golden age of wrestling was the Attitude Era. The new generation era, the new foundation era, it allowed a lot of stars to develop. And while some stars like your Kevin Nash and Scott Hall went to WCW, this opened the door for new stars to come in and start building their foundations, like your Steve Austin, who was called the Ringmaster and eventually became Stone Cold Steve Austin, Dwayne Johnson, who went through several gimmicks and eventually went and became The Rock. And then there was your John Paul Levesque, who eventually went from Hunter Hearst Helmsley to becoming Triple H, and Mick Foley coming over from WCW and became the character Mankind. And as this was going on, The Undertaker was evolving as a character, and he went from being the Phenom to becoming the Minister of Darkness, and all of these elements came into place and formed what many called the Attitude Era. Now, the Attitude Era was a new era of wrestling, basically meant to compete with WCW's New World Order and Hollywood Hogan. And this new era with new characters breathed brand new life into the World Wrestling Federation. And as it breathed brand new life into the World Wrestling Federation and told some very compelling stories, one of those stories actually made Vince McMahon come from behind the broadcast booth and the bookings center into the ring itself. Now, your Stone Cold Steve Austin had become a major star in World Wrestling Federation, but one of the stories that propelled him to superstardom was the story between your Stone Cold and your Vince McMahon, who became the character Mr. McMahon. And as he became the Mr. McMahon character, a lot of people started to relate to the Stone Cold Steve Austin character, because a lot of people, they had issues with their bosses, and in this storyline, they saw an employee finally getting revenge on their boss. That was one of the hooks as related to the whole Stone Cold versus Mr. McMahon storyline. And this storyline basically took the Stone Cold character, again, from the star as a WWF champion to mega star status, basically eclipsing Hulk Hogan. And your Stone Cold became an icon in wrestling, part due to this Mr. McMahon feud and his rebellious attitude against the authority, which was Mr. McMahon. So Vince McMahon was very smart in creating this Mr. McMahon character and allowing people to be able to see a hero actually taking on a boss. And this was one part of the Attitude Era that made it one of the best eras of wrestling, and basically a second golden age, because with your Stone Cold basically rebelling against your Mr. McMahon, your Rock basically cooking and roasting candy asses every week, and your Triple H building up as a member of D-Generation X, these rebellious characters basically created a second golden age of wrestling, which I say ran from about 1996 all the way to about 2004 or 2005. And what was very cool about the Attitude Era was the smooth, organic transition that the Attitude Era took into another part of a golden age, which was called the Ruthless Aggression Era. Now, the Ruthless Aggression Era, I say, started out about 2003, 2004, after a lot of bumps were taken towards the end of the Attitude Era with the merger, with the sale of WCW to Vince McMahon, and ECW sold to Vince McMahon. We started to see Vince create a brand new vision, and as he created this vision, it created a third golden age. And this third golden age of wrestling, the Ruthless Aggression Era, created many of today's modern day stars. So a lot of today's modern day superstars, we saw them develop. Some of them came out of the Attitude Era, like your Edge and your Christian. Others, like your John Cena, were built straight up from the ground. And we saw a more organic transition of these brand new superstars like your Edge, your John Cena, your Christian, your Batista, your Randy Orton. I mean, we saw Kurt Angle, many others built up very slowly, and this was all part of the Ruthless Aggression Era, which built up many of the modern day icons like the late great Eddie Guerrero. I just loved seeing him come up during the Ruthless Aggression Era, because I had been following him ever since he was a part of WCW and the LWO, and it was great to see him become a WWE champion, and it was great to see guys like John Cena become megastars like Stone Cold and Hulk Hogan. And that was all part of Vince McMahon's vision for wrestling. I mean, he basically took us from the Ruthless Aggression Era all the way into, from the Attitude Era, which is what I wanted to say, to the Ruthless Aggression Era. And we saw so many stars built up because of his leadership. I mean, Vince had a grand vision for wrestling, and that grand vision has basically taken pro wrestling for us, which was something that was a part of these little regional federations, and we went from wrestlers being part of regional federations and being seen, barely being seen on local TV, to wrestling becoming an international phenomenon which is seen all over the world and is basically seen in many countries. And that's all due to Vince McMahon having the grand vision back in the 80s to say, I'm going to take this wrestling from being something that's local in the United States and seen regionally, and I'm going to turn this into a national phenomenon. So Vince McMahon was a major part of many people's childhoods, including my own. Again, I used to sit there at 11 years old back in the mid-1980s, anticipating watching WWF superstars come on Channel 9 at 5 or 6 here in New York City, and I also anticipated watching those episodes of Saturday night's Main Event when they used to come on NBC in place of Saturday Night Live some weekends. I mean, this was major TV, especially when it got towards the late 80s with the whole Macho Man heel turn, where Hulk Hogan where he was trying to save Miss Elizabeth, and Macho Man thought he was trying to take Elizabeth from him. That was must-see TV back in the 80s, and that was a major event that led into WrestleMania, which led to Hulk Hogan getting, I believe, his second or third title reign. I believe it was his second title reign before he dropped the belt to Ultimate Warrior. I mean, this was a major event, and again, we wouldn't have had this major event if Vince McMahon didn't have the vision to go out here and see wrestling as something that Americans could see as a part of their everyday lives. And a lot of kids don't understand the impact, again, of Vince McMahon on their lives, because everything we see with pro wrestling today, whether it be WWE, which was WWF back when I was a kid, everything even with AEW and all of these other companies like WCW, we would not have seen anybody thinking about making wrestling a national phenomenon if it wasn't for Vince McMahon taking those steps back in the mid-80s to go out here and show us that wrestling is not just it was just not a local thing, that it was what he called sports entertainment, and this sports entertainment basically became must-see TV, especially for a lot of us kids in the 80s, and another generation, which was my cousin's generation, in the late 80s. I mean, I remember, again, he would tell me about what was going on because he had cable where he was, and again, it became a phenomenon for a new generation. They were the generation that was watching Stone Cold and The Rock and Triple H and Mankind, and another generation, which was after my cousin's generation, they were out here watching John Cena and Batista and Edge and CM Punk. So Vince McMahon, basically, he shaped the childhoods of multiple generations, and even though he is retiring, we can see that he had a major impact on pop culture, and he has a lasting legacy on the wrestling business. I mean, when I look at Vince McMahon, he basically has cemented his legacy as related to pro wrestling, taking his father's business from a local regional business and turning it into a international phenomenon, which is now a cemented part of American pop culture. And that's something that can't be taken away from Vince McMahon, even though he is retiring from the business due to questionable issues as related to several scandals as related to women. You can't really take away Vince McMahon's mark on the business, and you can't take away what he has contributed to the wrestling business. Because, again, when I look at Vince McMahon, I mean, you look at what he has brought to this business, nobody in the wrestling business has really come up to his level, outside of, I would say, maybe Ted Turner, by passively just letting WCW just do its thing. I mean, you can say Ted Turner did something, but none of this would have been possible as related to the business, because once Vince McMahon started making moves, that's when Ted Turner started making moves. So you really have to say that Vince McMahon, again, ushered in making pro wrestling an iconic part of America and an iconic part of American culture. So, I mean, it's a really sad thing to see Vince McMahon leave the wrestling business, but hopefully, I'm hoping that your Paul Levesque Triple H can take over the business, and I'm hoping that he can make it just as entertaining as his father-in-law did, and continue to make pro wrestling entertaining for another generation of viewers. And from what I've seen from his work on NXT, if your Triple H is just allowed to run the business, I believe that WWE would be in very good shape, because Triple H has shown with NXT he knows how to develop and cultivate stars organically, and I believe that the WWE would be in good hands if he's allowed to be left alone. I believe that Triple H can do a great job in developing and keeping the next generation of wrestling stars, and I believe he can go out here and help develop many of these young wrestlers develop their craft if he is left alone. Now, your Vince McMahon says, again, he's retiring from the business, and I'm hoping that he keeps his hands off the business at this point, because now that he's been caught up in several scandals, it's just best that he leave the business to Triple H, because these scandals as related to sex crimes and sexual affairs, they put a black mark on the business, and it's best that Vince just step aside and let Triple H run the business. Moreover, a lot of the booking decisions your Vince McMahon has made, I believe, is hampering the business, because he's been, as I see it, too much of pushing this Roman Reigns, and Roman Reigns and his title run is basically choking out the business and preventing the business from growing. I call him Hogan Reigns because he reminds me a lot of the Hulk Hogan title reign from 1980, I think, 4 to 1987, and towards the end of the Hogan title reign, it started to get boring, and the same thing is happening with Roman Reigns. He's starting to get boring, and your Vince McMahon is trying to book Roman Reigns like Hulk Hogan, and this is hurting the business because it's preventing new stars from becoming up and getting over with the fans. So that's one of the things your Vince McMahon was making a mistake on later in his life. The other one was pushing a guy like your Austin Theory, and your Theory has not been getting over with the fans because nobody is getting to know the character, and because nobody gets to know the character, nobody cares about the character. And this was one of the big problems that Vince had, was he was fixating on these two guys, trying to make them into the next Hulk Hogan, and using a rock and wrestling style approach to pushing them, not understanding that the business has changed, and you have to go out here and start building up guys to, again, be able to fill in case one of your wrestlers gets injured, and stop pushing guys like your Roman Reigns and pushing guys like Theory who just isn't ready, and stop pushing all of these guys who are old veterans like Brock Lesnar, who basically are, the audience is basically tired of seeing. I'm hoping that, again, that Triple H can come in here and start developing stars in a more organic fashion and go out here and start looking to, again, rebuild the brand. Because when I look at today's WWE, in the aftermath of your Vince McMahon's retirement, they are in rebuild mode, and now they're looking to go out here and build up new stars. And building up new stars, this is something WWE desperately needs to do. And now that Vince McMahon is retired, they have to start focusing on the future. So Vince McMahon stepping down and leaving wrestling, it's a bittersweet thing. I mean, it's sad to see one of the architects of a part of my childhood leave the business, and it's sad to see him leave in an ignominious fashion. But the whole thing is, his legacy will never be forgotten. When you think of the modern pro wrestling you see today, everything that you see today is due to Vince McMahon, and it's due to his faith in his vision almost 40 years ago. If it wasn't for Vince having that vision 40 years ago to take wrestling national, we wouldn't have what we see on TV today as what you call pro wrestling right now. You wouldn't have the sports entertainment aspects where you get these larger than life characters. You wouldn't have these storylines with these characters who change and evolve, and you would not have all of this coordinated action as related to sequence. You wouldn't have any of this if it wasn't for Vince McMahon, and he, again, is going to be sorely missed from the pro wrestling business, but his legacy will go on, and he will always be remembered as an icon in American history. So it's a sad thing to see Vince leave the business, and it's even sadder to see him leave as a result of these kinds of allegations as related to sexual impropriety, affairs, and possible sexual assaults. It's sad to see Vince McMahon leave this way, but there's no way of taking away his mark on the business, the same way there's no way of taking away Bill Cosby's mark on black entertainment. I mean, he's an icon, and again, Vince McMahon will always be remembered as an icon who revolutionized the wrestling business and made sports entertainment a part of American history. Now, if you want to try out my ISIS series book, which pays homage to the world of pro wrestling, you can pick up my book, ISIS the Main Event, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. I wrote this story as a tribute to pro wrestling, which has been a part of my life since I was 11 years old, and I wanted to go out here and show respect for a part of the business that is part of what inspires me to write comic books, and also inspires me to write all of the action-packed fantasy I write on the SJS Direct imprint. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a wicked werewolf in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman in paperback and e-readers today.